1. Opening. The impossible survivors beneath the soil for the first 15 seconds. Let me pull you straight into the heart of a mystery. Imagine this. 1,000 years after the last Viking set foot on its deck, a long-buried ship rises from the soil of a cold Norwegian field. Its hull is darkened, its timbers creak under the weight of centuries, yet the wood, fragile, organic, and destined to decay, remains astonishingly intact. How is that possible? How did a civilization with no electricity, no chemistry labs, and no synthetic coatings create a moisture barrier that modern science still struggles to match? And what forgotten principle allowed their wood to survive the one enemy we fear most in building? Water. As archaeologists brush away the final layers of earth, one truth becomes undeniable. The Vikings knew something we've forgotten, something that defies our assumptions about rot, weather, and time itself. Today, we uncover that secret. 2. The modern era. The war against water in the modern world. We wage war on water. We seal wood beneath synthetic shells, wrap walls in layers of engineered membranes, and design coatings that promise total waterproof protection. Our entire philosophy rests on a single belief. If moisture can't get in, decay can't begin. Yet this confidence hides a fatal flaw. Because when we lock wood inside an airtight prison, moisture does not disappear. It simply becomes trapped. A hairline crack forms in the sealant. A bit of condensation sneaks behind a membrane. Suddenly, water is sealed inside, unable to escape, unable to evaporate. What happens next is predictable and devastating. Mold blooms, fibers swell, fungi spread. The more aggressively we try to isolate wood from nature, the faster nature exploits our mistake. Modern construction failures repeat the same pattern. Sealed decks rotting from the inside, waterproof coatings splitting under temperature swings, maintenance-free, materials collapsing without warning. The truth is uncomfortable but essential. Modern engineering does not misunderstand wood, it misunderstands moisture. 3. Viking mindset. Water is not the enemy. Stagnation is the Vikings approached the world differently. To them, wood was not a dead material to be imprisoned behind barriers. It was alive. It breathed. It moved with the seasons. And because it lived, it needed to exist in harmony with the elements, not in opposition to them. Instead of forcing water out, the Vikings focused on controlling how water moved. Moisture was allowed to enter briefly, but never to stay. Water flowed through the wood the same way wind flowed across the sea, passing, not pooling. And in that simple understanding lay their genius. Rot does not come from exposure. Rot comes from stagnation. Their sagas describe ships frozen into winter harbors, locked in ice for months, yet still seaworthy when the thaw returned. Coastal stories tell of planks flexing in violent storms without splitting, and seasoned beams resisting decades of salt spray. Generations of Norwegian shipwrights, whose traditions trace back to Viking hands, still echo the same principle. A well-crafted hull does not fight the water, it moves with it. This mindset, this quiet mastery of moisture, became the foundation of a survival philosophy so effective that many Viking wooden structures have outlived modern materials designed with far more technology. And it is here, in this ancient way of thinking, that we begin to grasp the secret moisture barrier modern science still cannot beat. 4. Seasoning, the step modern builders forgot before the Vikings ever touched a drop of tar. They relied on a far older wisdom. Wood must first be allowed to become itself. Seasoning was not an optional step. It was the foundation on which every other technique depended. When fresh timber is cut, it carries a heavy burden. Water locked deep in its fibers, sugars that feed fungi, and internal stresses that twist and warp as the wood dries. The Vikings understood that none of these forces could be rushed or sealed away. Only time could resolve them. So they let time do its work. Logs were left to dry across multiple seasons, stacked where the northern winds could sweep through their grain. They were raised off the ground, rotated through the year, and stored in simple but cleverly ventilated sheds that prevented rain from soaking the surface while still allowing air to circulate. Slowly, the timber shed its internal moisture. Sugars drained away, lignin and cellulose stabilized. What remained was wood that no longer strained against itself. Wood that breathed evenly, and wood that welcomed preservation instead of resisting it. By contrast, the modern world has abandoned patience. We seal boards fresh from the mill, trap moisture beneath glossy coats, and create the perfect ecological chamber for rot. In our rush for efficiency, we accelerate decay. We imprison water before it has a chance to leave, and in doing so, we give fungi everything they need to thrive. The Vikings, without laboratories or moisture meters, avoided this mistake entirely. They worked with nature rather than against it, and it was this quiet respect for the material, this willingness to let the wood become stable before strengthening it, that made their preservation system nearly unbreakable. Seasoning was not just preparation, it was the first shield. 5. The craft of tar, fire, resin, and patience. When the wood was ready, the Vikings turned to one of the most remarkable substances they ever mastered, pine tar. But pine tar was not a commodity. It was a craft, part chemistry, part ritual, and part survival. High in the Scandinavian forests, they carved sloping pits into the earth, lining them with turf and stone. Into these pits they packed split pine roots, resin-rich and fragrant. Then they lit a slow, smoldering fire, one that did not blaze, but instead coaxed the resin from the wood. As the heat crept through the packed timber, the resin broke down. Light tar dripped thin and golden, while heavier tar emerged thick and dark, pooling into collection vessels buried beneath the pit. A single burn could last for days, filling the air with a sweet, smoky scent that clung to clothing and tools. This was not crude oil. This was a living resin, elastic, aromatic, and filled with compounds that resisted water and slowed decay. Archaeologists still uncover ancient tar pits across Norway and Sweden, perfectly preserved impressions of a forgotten industry that sustained entire coastal communities. To the Vikings, pine tar was more than a preservative. It was a companion to the sea. It bound their ship planks, sealed their roofs, protected their tools, and even served medicinal purposes. Every batch bore the signature of the land itself, its forests, its resin, its fire. And because they created it by hand, they understood its character, how it thickened in the cold, softened in heat, and bonded with wood as if the two had been designed for each other. Modern coatings rely on rigid chemistry. Viking tar relied on patient transformation, and that patience produced a substance modern materials struggle to mimic even today. 6. Deep penetration, transforming wood from the inside out. Once the tar was prepared, the final transformation began. Unlike modern coatings, which simply sit on the surface like armor, Viking tar was meant to become part of the wood itself. To achieve this, they warmed the timber gently in sunlight or near the hearth, allowing the pores to open. When the heated tar touched the warmed grain, something remarkable happened. The tar was drawn inward, sinking into the cell walls, filling microscopic channels, and replacing the last traces of internal moisture. This process did not create a barrier, it created a conversion. Instead of wrapping the wood in a shell, the Vikings infused it with a substance that behaved almost identically to lignin, the natural polymer that gives wood its strength. Both tar and lignin expand and contract at nearly the same rate, which meant the treated wood could flex with temperature changes without cracking. Even in freezing winters, the tar remained supple. It moved when the hull moved. It breathed when the wood breathed. It never turned brittle, never peeled, and never trapped water inside. Modern sealants, despite their impressive chemistry, fail at this exact point. They harden, they stiffen, they crack. And once a crack forms, it does not matter how advanced the coating is. Moisture slips in, gets trapped, and begins its quiet destruction. Viking tar avoided this failure by refusing to become rigid in the first place. It offered flexibility, breathability, and a perfect partnership with the natural behavior of wood. In this union of material and method, the Vikings achieved something profound. They did not coat wood, they transformed it. And it is here, in this deep infiltration of resin into the very architecture of the timber, that the ancient method surpasses modern science. Where we build barriers, they built harmony. And harmony, it turns out, endures far longer. 7. The one-way moisture system, a breathable shield. When Viking tar penetrated seasoned timber, it created something astonishing. A one-way moisture system that allowed wood to live without ever letting rot take hold. To understand its brilliance, imagine water striking a tar-treated plank during a storm. Liquid water could not seep inward. The tar-saturated cell walls repelled it instantly, causing droplets to bead and slide away. Yet at the same time, the wood never became suffocated. Vapor locked inside the timber could still migrate outward, escaping through microscopic pathways that tar did not clog but merely guided. This balance, blocking water in its dangerous form while allowing moisture in its harmless form to escape, was the essence of the Viking method. It prevented stagnation, the true cause of rot, and denied fungi the damp, sugar-rich environment they needed to survive. Without standing moisture and without lingering nutrients, fungal threads simply could not colonize the timber. They could touch the surface, but they could not pierce it. And this idea was not limited to the Vikings. Across the world, other ancient cultures arrived at similar truths. In Japan, the art of urushi lacquer allowed wood to breathe despite its glossy appearance, creating furniture that resisted centuries of humidity. In the alpine regions of Europe, woodworkers soaked beams in natural oils derived from resinous trees, enabling mountain chalets to endure snowmelt and freeze cycles for generations. Among the Sami people of the far north, skis coated with pine tar glided over snow, while resisting water absorption, keeping them light, flexible, and alive in brutal winter conditions. These parallels reveal something profound. Long before modern science tried to dominate moisture, ancient cultures learned to negotiate with it. The Viking method was not an isolated accident. It was part of a global pattern, humans listening to nature, not overpowering it. And nowhere was this partnership as refined or as structurally complete as in the architecture and shipbuilding of the Norse world. 8. Structural intelligence, designs that helped the barrier work. The Viking moisture barrier was never just a material, it was a system, woven into the very geometry of their ships and homes. Tar-treated wood was only the beginning. The designers of the North added structural intelligence that worked alongside the moisture barrier to create something almost self-sustaining. On their ships, planks were arranged in the legendary clinker pattern, each overlapping the next, like the scales of a fish. This design shed water naturally, channeling waves and rain away from seams. A clinker hull flexed with the ocean, never fighting it, and the tar between the planks sealed without cracking. Every wave strengthened the marriage between wood and resin. On land, their longhouses rose above the soil, lifted on stones or low pillars to prevent ground moisture from creeping upward. The roofs soared at steep angles, 50 to 60 degrees, so rain and snow had no place to linger. Any moisture that touched the structure slid away with the pull of gravity. Even their joints, carved with painstaking precision, avoided creating bowls or pockets where water could pool. The Vikings did not design shapes, they designed flow. This harmony between form and material meant that no single component had to fight water alone. The tar protected the wood. The structure guided the water. The airflow dried what remained. Together they formed a unified shield, flexible, breathable, and astonishingly durable. When we say the Viking barrier was a system, this is what we mean. It was never one trick, but an entire philosophy of survival built into every curve, every joint, and every beam. 9. Archaeology never lies. The proof under 1,000 winters, if the Viking method were only theory, we might dismiss it as myth. But the earth itself preserves the evidence. When the Oseberg ship was unearthed from a burial mound after nearly 12 centuries underground, its timbers had not dissolved into mush as any untreated wood would have. They were worn, yes, but still recognizable, still strong enough to lift, still bonded by the tar that once traveled deep into their grain. The Gokstad ship told the same story. Its hull, exposed to centuries of damp soil, displayed fibers that had resisted fungal attack with an effectiveness no modern coating has matched. Researchers at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo placed samples of Oseberg and Gokstad wood under a microscope. What they found was astonishing. Fungal penetration was dramatically reduced. The cell walls remained intact. The tar was still present inside the fibers, not as a brittle crust, but as a flexible partner to the wood. Further testing revealed another secret. The elasticity of the tar-treated wood remained far higher than untreated samples. While ordinary buried timber becomes soft, spongy, and structurally collapsed, Viking wood preserved its internal architecture. Even microscopic layers showed signs of coherent bonding, the same bonding that once allowed ships to cross frozen seas and storm-torn coastlines. In contrast, untreated wood recovered from similar environments was almost unrecognizable, crumbled, eaten through by fungi, warped beyond use. The difference was not subtle, it was profound, and it provides the final, undeniable proof that the Viking moisture barrier was not a legend. It was a scientific victory achieved centuries before science had a name. This is the moment in our story where myth becomes measurable reality. And it is here, under 1,000 winters of soil and ice, that the Vikings speak their truth. Their understanding of wood and water still outperforms much of what we create today. 10. Rebuilding the Ancient Method, a practical survivalist guide. If the Viking method were merely historical, it would be fascinating but irrelevant. Yet the beauty of their system lies in how accessible it still is. You can recreate it today with simple tools, natural materials, and a bit of patience. It begins exactly where the Vikings began, with wood that has already learned to breathe. Choose timber that has been seasoned, air-dried for months or even years. The lighter the board feels in the hand, the more stable and ready it is for preservation. Once you have your wood, warm it gently. Sunlight will do, or the radiant heat of a small fire. Your goal is not to cook the wood, but to open its pores, preparing it for a deeper bond. Heat your pine tar as well, thinning it with a small amount of linseed oil or fish oil until it flows smoothly, just as Viking shipwrights did on cold mornings by the fjord. Brush the warm tar onto the warm wood, moving slowly with the grain. Do not chase a glossy surface. Let the wood drink, wipe away nothing. Return again the next day and the next, each layer sinking deeper than the one before. Pay special attention to the end grain, the place where water loves to enter. Saturate it until it darkens like wet earth. As days pass, you will watch the wood transform, becoming heavier, richer, and more resilient. When the treatment is finished, maintenance becomes almost effortless. A light coat once every few years is enough. No sanding, no stripping, no frantic repairs. Just a renewal of the bond between resin and grain, and the uses are endless. Build an off-grid cabin whose walls adapt to every season. Drive fence posts into the soil without poisoning the ground. Strengthen tool handles that endure rain, sweat, and cold without cracking. Construct small bridges or walkways that shrug off freezing winters. In a world racing towards synthetic solutions, this ancient method offers something rare, a natural system that works with the rhythm of the environment rather than against it. And it works just as well now as it did 1,000 years ago. 11. Why modern science still loses. The illusion of absolute control with all our laboratories, polymers, and precision coatings. How is it that the Vikings still outperform us in the art of preserving wood? The answer reaches beyond chemistry and straight into philosophy. Modern science tends to design materials as if they were dead. Static, motionless, unchanging objects meant to obey our commands. We build barriers meant to resist, to dominate, to silence the forces of nature. But the Vikings understood the opposite truth. Wood is alive, even after the tree has fallen. It breathes. It expands with warmth and contracts with cold. It drinks in the morning air and releases moisture at night. A material like this cannot be imprisoned. It must be accompanied. The failure of modern coatings lies in their rigidity. We ask them to create absolute control, perfect protection, and zero compromise. Yet nature does not respect absolutes. The smallest crack becomes a doorway. The thinnest bead of trapped water becomes a rot colony. Modern engineering often falters because it refuses to practice humility. It seeks perfection instead of balance. The Vikings, with their tar and patience, embraced a humbler wisdom. They did not seek to conquer moisture. They sought to guide it. And by doing so, they achieved a durability modern materials still struggle to replicate. Their method reminds us that technology is not always about being stronger. Sometimes it is about understanding the material in front of you. Sometimes it is about listening. 12. What the Vikings truly knew. The philosophy of endurance. As we look back on the Viking method, the lesson becomes unmistakable. Endurance is not born from resistance. It is born from adaptation. The Vikings recognized that nature is not an enemy to be defeated, but a partner to negotiate with. Their ships survived storms because they moved with the waves, not against them. Their wood endured centuries because it welcomed moisture without allowing stagnation. This philosophy dismantles the belief that ancient methods are primitive or outdated. In truth, They are sophisticated systems rooted in deep observation and respect. Tar-treated wood, seasoned by time, strengthened by fire, and shaped by design, is not a relic of the past. It is proof that simplicity, when guided by wisdom, can surpass complexity. Every surviving Viking plank carries a message. Strength is not a battle. It is a relationship. Their moisture barrier worked because it honored the natural rules of the world. And in our search for durable, sustainable solutions today, this ancient perspective may be more valuable than ever. 13. Closing. Beneath the tar, 1,000 conversations with nature. In the end, what remains of the Viking world is not just metal or legend, but wood, blackened, resilient, whispering its story through the centuries. Beneath the thin sheen of tar lies 1,000 conversations between human hands and the forces of nature. Conversations of patience, balance, humility, and understanding. The warriors who once sailed these ships are long gone, but their craftsmanship endures in every preserved fiber. And as we stand in front of these ancient timbers today, we are reminded that the most powerful technologies are often the ones rooted in simplicity. So let this knowledge not fade. Let it guide builders, survivalists, and curious minds. Because sometimes the answers we search for in laboratories have already been perfected in the hands of those who came before us. And sometimes the strongest shield is nothing more than wood, tar, and the wisdom to let nature breathe.